Well, you wrote a book. Put it out there. Guess that's something. Before we get started, I'd just like to mention, if you enjoy this kind of content and want to see more book reviews or book news type stuff, or just anything that I do on my channel, leave it in the comments below. And I'm always looking forward for more stuff to read. So let's get back to the book. And today we're looking at Rust Maidens by Gwendolyn Kriste. First, let's get into what this book is about and why I picked it up. In summary, the book revolves around a girl named Phoebe. It mostly takes place in Cleveland in the summer of 1980, and it also bounces forward a couple of times by about 30 years. It starts and ends when she's an adult, but it goes back for most of the novel to the 1980 when she was 18 and just graduating from high school. Every so often, you get interspersed chapters when she's an adult and she's returned to Cleveland and she's, interacting with people that you get introduced to from when she was a teenager. The meat of the story all happens when she's a teenager in 1980, and in part, I'd say this is why I think that the time-shifting aspect didn't add anything to the story. As an 18-year-old, Phoebe was kind of an outcast in her community, even to the point her aunt hated her guts, and her only friend was her cousin Jacqueline. During the course of the novel, the mills that are in Cleveland are being shut down, and a lot of the parents are getting laid off. At one point, the families all gather to picket and protest for a union representation, and then they all just get laid off. A big portion of this book has to do with the decay of that specific neighborhood in Cleveland, as we don't get very many interactions with anybody outside of the neighborhood. The houses are being emptied and falling apart. The neighborhood is depressed, poor, and getting worse, and there's no promise for a future for anyone. Phoebe and her class just graduated high school, and following that graduation, the girls on the street slowly start transforming into Rust Maidens. With skin made out of glass and steel, bleeding black water, and eyes like oil, Phoebe is the only one that isn't transforming, and she takes it upon herself to try and figure out what is going on before all the girls in the neighborhood are lost to this weird transformation thing. The government comes in at some point to study the girls, and then eventually, in some big blowout they had built that had... The government comes in at some point to study the girls, and then eventually in some big blowout that had no build-up whatsoever, the neighborhood is split between the ones that want to attack the girls and the ones that want to defend the girls. The house the Maidens are hiding in is destroyed, and the Maidens move on to wherever the abandoned mill is and fuse with one of the coal stoves that's still there, and then they disappear. That's the basic gist of it. I got this book because at the time I was writing my novel Creatures Lie Here, which also has a sort of humans turning into monsters kind of mechanic to it. I don't remember how I stumbled across the Rust Maidens specifically, and when I was reading the blurb for this, it mentioned the transformation of girls into Rust Maidens, and I said, I want to read other people's descriptions of humanoid creatures interacting with the world and how they played with whatever symbolism was going on, if there was any, and how they did the descriptions, because in mine I've got humans that are still technically humans interacting with the world differently, but it's the way their souls look are on the outside. So you've got monstrous people doing normal things. So I just wanted to see what other people in that kind of magical realism horror realm were doing. Now, the bad news. I really didn't like this book. So the first problem was the main character, and she was the biggest problem that I had with the book. Phoebe was an insufferable, self-righteous teenager who wasn't particularly good at anything. She was just a conduit for the reader to see what was happening in Cleveland without it actually happening to her, because all of the other girls in her neighborhood were the ones that were transforming. She never made me like her, which likability isn't necessary for a good novel, but you have to draw the reader in somehow. And if it's not with likability, it has to be some kind of skill. You have to be kind of really intriguing about something, really peculiar about something. And she really didn't have anything going for her. In fact, sometimes it felt like the narrative was being really lazy with her, trying to create sympathy via making everybody else hate her. And by trying to make everybody else hate her and mistreat her, then maybe you'd feel sorry for her and start liking her and have a kinship with her. But the fact that everybody disliked her and then she was always complaining about everybody anyway and she was always bitter, like she wasn't humble about being disliked. She was aggressive back, or aggressive first, before being treated badly, and then they treat her badly, and then it was just this bundle. So she never gave a reason to like her because she wasn't likable. Other people hated her, and then when she acted out against the people who were being dicks to her, I just kind of went, okay, so I get why they're dicks to you. I don't really feel anything for you. I know why you don't have any friends. You make fun of all the other girls. The one thing that was different for her is that she had a tree house in her backyard that she'd converted into a bug house, a bug sanctuary, really, where she nested butterflies and all sorts of bugs, but that really didn't become any kind of importance. It was just kind of a weird quirk. She hid in it a couple of times, but it really didn't mean anything. At one point she used it. She was trying to protect a baby, and she went up there and hid in the treehouse, and then anytime anybody tried to come and get her to steal the baby from her, she just kind of pushed the ladder down. But then, of course, the dude that she had a crush on climbed up, and then it didn't even matter anyway. And so it was just like a minor roadblock at one point, but it didn't do anything. It didn't mean anything other than, for how many times it's brought up in the narrative, it really didn't do anything. Everyone in town seemed to hate her, and she equally hated everyone else. She spent the time around her parents when she was 18, complaining. Meanwhile, when she was an adult, she suddenly forgave them all and liked them without showing any sort of resolution as to how she came to that. It's kind of just like, oh, you're old and you're dying, I guess I can forgive you, without ever actually showing that mindset. It was just like, auntie is in her decrepit house dying, okay, I forgive you. Mom is moving to a retirement home, okay, I forgive you. And dad is in his hospital bed, probably going to die sometime soon. I guess I can just forgive everybody without actually talking over any of these points. It's what old people do. It's told that Phoebe hadn't been home since she left 30 years ago, and it was implied that she didn't talk to her family much, if at all. I can't fully remember if it said that they had phone conversations every now and then. I want to lean on the side of no, but I can't recall fully. When she was 18 and when we're in the flashbacks to her childhood, her mom was basically a lush that gossiped with the other moms in the neighborhood, who, by chance, are also lushes. The mom is always complaining about how Phoebe can't get along with anyone and how Phoebe is kind of the cause for all of the drama in the neighborhood. It's explained that Phoebe's aunt hates her because she's jealous of Phoebe and her mom getting the attention of her dad, the aunt's brother. Her aunt lost her husband some time ago and is more or less alone except for her daughter Jacqueline, who is Phoebe's best friend and cousin. The aunt is overbearing and does everything in her power to stop them from hanging out or talking when she can. The girls have to sneak around. The aunt yells and basically drags the girl back to the house, even though she's 18 now. Throughout the teenage chapters, before the girls start transforming, we get to see how annoyed Phoebe is with everyone in the neighborhood via a giant potluck block party, and congratulations to the new graduates. She spends the majority of the party complaining about the different families, complaining about the other girls in the class. She just doesn't like any of them, doesn't connect with any of them, and then her and Jacqueline run off to go and hang out on a beach and not be around other people. Over time, each of the girls, there are 5 of them, begin to transform into the Rust Maiden, and it's as though these transformations... Over time, each of these girls, and there are 5 of them, begin to transform into the Rust Maidens, and it's through these transformations that she becomes less complainy about everyone in the neighborhood and starts actually defending the girls that she once hated while going after all of the parents because it's their fault that this is happening. There's even a point near the end, and I knew it was going to happen, where Phoebe is asked by her parents to just go to church today as a family for the first time in a long time. And who would have guessed it that once she got to church, she was listening to the church sermon going on, and then she stood up and just screamed at everybody for being hypocrites. As she stands in front of the congregation and focuses on each of the parents or families who've lost a child to the Rust Maiden disease thing, she then screams why nobody is standing up with her to defend the girls. The funny thing is, one of the government guys fell in love with her and decides to stand up to defend the girls, and instead of saying, look, I've got solidarity from somebody who doesn't even know me and this neighborhood very well, he'll stand with me, why won't you? She actually just glares at him until he sits down and then turns around and goes, "Why won't anybody stand up with me and defend these girls?" She's the savior of the whole thing, while everyone else in the neighborhood either hates her, is a lush, is useless, or abusive, or is a mixture of all of the elements above. It feels more like an ugly girl syndrome kind of thing going on, because they try to make Phoebe look better by putting her around all of these worse characters, uglier personalities, uglier characters. And so, like, when you have a meh girl next to an ugly girl, the meh girl looks a lot hotter. This feels like putting a meh personality character next to a bunch of really bad personality characters, and then you go, okay, maybe Phoebe's not that bad. Throughout the novel, Phoebe could do no wrong. And the narration let us know that. It lets us know she's the only person trying to do what's right, and everyone else was wrong, selfish, and gross. It didn't make Phoebe look good, and it didn't help the book look good at all. The second thing that I ran into very, very early on was the way that Kriste wrote about the men. Every single male character written was either abusive, mostly abusive, pig-headed, pushy. None of them had redeeming qualities whatsoever. There was one character introduced, a member of the government named Adrian, I've mentioned him a couple of times now, who took a random liking to Phoebe for no reason. He just kind of sees her and starts flirting when they're in the same room, and despite the fact that every time Phoebe is around, she is standoffish, he still gets her out of everything and is really into her. That is, so the government guys show up in the neighborhood. Let me give you an example. So the government guys show up in the neighborhood and they pick a random house on the street that's been empty for a while to set up their base in so they can study the Maidens and have somewhere close to be. They don't change any of the locks on this place, despite the fact that they're leaving all of their paperwork just kind of out on the tables, out in the living room, everywhere. And so Phoebe goes and gets a spare key that she knew where it was for the house from when the family was living there, and breaks into the house basically to go and look through their paperwork to see if she can find anything on these girls that they know that she doesn't. And Adrian just lets her, and then sneaks her back out and doesn't say anything. And he's only known her for like a couple of days, maybe, and they don't even spend a lot of time together. He's just so fascinated by her. So fascinated. She gets into a number of other problems throughout the book, and he gets her back out of them, and she never so much as says thank you. She's really just snotty the whole time. Snotty and ungrateful. Though she does sleep with him at least once. So does that count as being grateful? You tell me. The relationship between the two of them didn't build in any way. It was just kind of there at some point, and it didn't feel justified. It didn't feel like there was anything there, especially for him to say, hey, you should come to Washington, D.C. with me, and we're going to take the girls and the research there. You should just come because what's left for you here. That was like after a week, maybe a week. It was not long. It might not have been a week, but it wasn't long. So getting out of this love cycle, all of the men are useless and abusive. Even Adrian, even though Adrian is not abusive in any way, he is presented as useless. He can't get Phoebe any information on the Maidens. He can't help her out in any way other than not getting arrested a couple of times. And come to the end, he doesn't even have a voice to speak out with. He tries to defend her and the Rust Maidens against his government partners, who then strip him of his position, and Phoebe moves on to take care of business while following the Maidens to their end and seeing them off. Clint, one of the other prominent male characters, is the teen father of an infant for one of Phoebe's classmates, and also Phoebe's ex-boyfriend who cheated on her. He's an alcoholic when he's 18, and when she comes back 30 years later, he's still an alcoholic, and he's done nothing with his life. He doesn't take care of his child. His child apparently doesn't even know him, even though she was left in his stead when she was 18, and he doesn't take care of himself. He can't take care of himself. He just hangs out at a bar. Phoebe hates all the other girls' fathers as they're all useless and happy to throw girls under the bus in order to save their skin. She even tries to not hate her dad. There's one scene where all of the fathers are hanging out in Phoebe's dad's kitchen, and they're all talking and they're sharing their frustrations, and they're saying we should just give the government the girls, throwing the girls under the bus, and then her dad isn't arguing or saying anything to it, and Phoebe's just there around the corner going, I knew it. You're a traitor, just like the rest of them. At least have a spine. And then she has her internal monologue that says, you're worse than all of them because you don't have enough of a spine to tell them no, and instead you're giving them a platform, a forum, to have their crappy discussions. The forum, mind you, is just them standing in her kitchen having a discussion. But her dad is worthless, was more spineless, and then she yells at her dad and kind of runs off, and her dad is like, wait, no, listen, and she's like, no, and then she leaves. So, of course, useless, spineless, all bad, all of them bad. The two main flaws for the narration are constantly reminding you of things that have happened to fill out pages and impulsively telling you if something someone said was true or right or a flat-out lie after somebody says something. Some of the quotes that I have written down are, the sermon started at 9 on the dot, and today was all about tolerance and kindness and every other model and topic. We were going to keep on as if nothing had changed. The girls got sick, the girls transformed, the girls were liable to evaporate into rust at midnight, our own grotesque Cinderellas, and we would just keep showing up on Sunday morning and praying and pretending nothing had ever happened. But something bad happened. Our lives had been ripped from us, and we were too craven to admit it. Another quote. She filled a white styrofoam cup to the brim, and we stared at each other for a while. This should have felt familiar, almost safe, all things considered, but now a different kind of loathing brewed behind her gaze. She blamed me the same way that everybody else blamed me, like I wanted the girls to go to the mansion, like I was the one keeping them there. Another quote. The corners of my mouth twitch, and I want to scream. I want to hear how loud my voice will echo in this place where there is no congregation, no hope, no point in its miserable existence. Not that there ever was a compelling reason for a church to exist, not even 30 years ago when we all pretended to believe. And another quote. Them, the girls, the Rust Maidens. This was what we did. We stripped them of who they were, everything about them. From the very start of this was all impersonal, a snarl of generic files from the government, a mess of inoperable figures from the doctor's office, a curse on the lips of our fathers, all of us lumping the 5 of them together because it was easier that way. And you can just imagine these same kinds of ideas repeated all of the time for the whole duration of the 250 pages, because it's brought up very often. As an example of the lie thing I was talking about, it would be something like, quote, go to the mall. He said this, but I knew he didn't mean it. Or, I love you, said my father, but it was all a lie. So it was stuff like that constantly. And then finally, one more peeve I have to mention on this dialogue. There was a moment in the, well, I guess it wasn't dialogue, it was in the narrative, when she was arguing with her mom and she was like, oh, I wanted to injure her so bad with my words. I wanted to say such mean things. And there was just this paragraph of her saying how badly she wanted to say something mean to her mom. And then finally, quote, she says something mean, end quote, and it says, I grinned cruelly. That doesn't help you make it more cruel. You're making it comedic. That's bad. Now to the build-up. Near the end of the novel, after the church outburst from Phoebe, there's a moment when the neighborhood basically splits into two, and it made me think of the climax in Beauty and the Beast when the villagers all storm the castle behind Gaston. Phoebe's aunt basically becomes the lead of the neighborhood that's against the Rust Maidens and wants to rip down the house. While on the other side, you've got Phoebe, who's leading the we have to protect them mob, of course, because she's the righteous one. Throughout the novel, there really is no build-up between these two things. You just know that the aunt hates Phoebe, and that now Phoebe is taking charge of trying to figure out what's going on with the girls while everybody else is just being selfish. And then all of a sudden, you've got half the neighborhood is against the girls, and it just materializes all of a sudden in the church, and they go and storm the castle with a fire hose. It doesn't make any sense. Then after the build-up, there's an immediate ending. As an adult, Phoebe has gone back to her best friend's home, and it's an abandoned crypt of a place, and she finds her aunt living in squalor. She never talked to her aunt in the whole time that she was gone for 30 years. At least it never implied that she did. It kind of implied that she had no contact whatsoever. And the aunt walks up to her after hearing somebody enter the house and apologizes, and then wanders off and says, I'm just going to die here. And that is the end of that. There's really no reason for it unless you go, she's old, she's dying, so she's doing her piece as whatever, which is a cop-out. Just kind of a Deus Ex Machina thrown in there at the ending to kind of, I don't know, make you try to make you hate them less, but there's no redemption for any of these people. None of them. And especially considering with how much the aunt said that she was motivated by her jealousy of Phoebe's connection to her brother. You'd think that the aunt would be living in the hospital, would be close with the brother, would have taken the opportunity that once Phoebe left the city, she would try to sweep in and get that friendship back with her brother, because also now her daughter is gone. But no. Instead, we just have the flashbacks where every interaction with the aunt is aggressive and negative because she's jealous. In closing, after finishing the novel, I wondered, what was the point? The girls had their futures taken away from them by the failures of the previous generation. Is that what the novel was trying to say? It seems like that was the theme to me. If this was the theme of the story and why the girls rusted away, how did the condition of Cleveland not affect the boys of Cleveland? When you look at Clint, who was the only male classmate ever mentioned in the novel, he didn't have a future either. All of his father and his family were all sent out of the mill while he was just graduating school, which meant he didn't have a future in what his dad had been doing. He became a drunk and he hung out at bars, and he was a single father because his baby mama disappeared. He was single and without a job 30 years later, and it seems the girls of Cleveland wouldn't have been the only ones affected by the failure of the economy, the lack of support, and nowhere to go. So what was the actual cause of the Rust Maidens? Worse, when Phoebe goes back to Cleveland as an adult, she meets Quinn, and even now I have no idea who Quinn is. It's just some girl who kind of shows up in the first chapter when she's an adult, and I went back and I looked and I couldn't find anything saying what she was. At this point, I just think that she's a random girl without a family to kind of symbolize the next generation's hopelessness without anywhere to go, without anybody to help them. She begins, and at the end of the novel, she begins turning into a Rust Maiden as well, and Phoebe wants to figure out how to stop it because she couldn't figure out how to stop it with her best friend. In the end, Phoebe's mom gives Phoebe a $10,000 bond that was meant for her when she went to college, but Phoebe never went to college, she just kind of left. So now that $10,000 bond is actually worth $30,000. Phoebe gives Quinn that $10,000/$30,000 bond and tells Quinn to get out of Cleveland, and this stops the transformation, leaving it to the idea that the Rust Maidens were the girls' potential/future being eaten away by a dead-end society. But if that's the case, again, how did the boys go unchanged? And number two, there was another little girl, the infant who was from one of the Rust Maidens, and whose father was the drunk Clint, and she turned out into an adult. You see her in the flash forwards when Phoebe is almost 50, and she's fine. She's there. She looks single. She never mentions a family, and she's just kind of hanging out around Phoebe's house. So this little girl's potential was not as destroyed as the Rust Maidens, but she obviously didn't go anywhere. So the whole reason behind everything was completely lost to me. I think this book would have done better if it stayed in the period of the 1980s when Phoebe was graduating and then dealing with coming into the world, as a new adult who's no longer in school and trying to deal with that and struggling with finding her purpose and finding her value in society, as it seemed like society around was collapsing and there was no motivation or support in the community around her, which is what ate away the girls. I think by expanding it into multiple generations, Kriste ended up asking more questions that she was unable to answer and creating more plot holes that wouldn't have been a problem if she just left it in the 1980s. I also didn't see anything added to the story by jumping into her as a 50-year-old and then coming back in time. It didn't focus enough on the drama, the cause of it, and thorough creation of the characters. It was shallow, repetitive, and unsatisfying, as the ending didn't mean anything and didn't solve anything, because the actual problem was never presented or solved. Yeah, just throw money at one girl from your neighborhood and now everything is much better, huh? I don't know. At risk of having said too much already, this is where I'll end it, and I'm sorry, but this book just wasn't good. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Leave me your book suggestions, and I will see you next time. Oof.